Why is Argentina's national football team almost entirely white while Brazil, right next door, has always been full of black players? Why do two neighboring football-obsessed countries on the same continent, sharing borders, sharing a river, sharing a colonial history, look completely different on the pitch? Here's the answer nobody in Argentina wants said out loud, and once you hear it, you will never watch an Argentina match the same way again. In the early 1800s, black people made up nearly a third of Argentina's entire population, and in some cities, half then, within a few generations, they were gone from the national picture. Not because they packed up and left, but because Argentina ran one of the most effective demographic erasure campaigns in the Western Hemisphere. And it worked so completely that most Argentines today genuinely believe their country was never black to begin with. Tonight we are going through every stage of that erasure, in full, with names, dates, numbers, and the people who lived and died inside it. Because a story this deliberately buried deserves the full hour it takes to actually tell it. Let's start at the beginning, because you cannot understand how a population disappears if you do not first understand how large it was. Buenos Aires, from its earliest colonial decades, was one of the major ports of the transatlantic slave trade into South America. Enslaved Africans were brought through the Rio de la Plata in significant numbers from the late 1500s onward. But the trade intensified dramatically in the 18th century once the Spanish crown opened the port more fully to commerce, and the British South Sea Company gained the Asiento, the contract to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish-American territories in the early 1700s. Ships arrived from West and Central Africa, from ports along the coasts that are today Angola, the Congo, and parts of West Africa, carrying human cargo destined for the estates, households, workshops, and docks of the Rio de la Plata region. By the time of the first serious colonial census efforts in the late 1700s, the demographic reality of the viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata was unmistakable. This was not a marginal population. This was a foundational one. The 1778 colonial census, one of the earliest reasonably systematic population counts taken in the region, documented substantial black and mixed-race populations across the territory that would become Argentina. But it is the numbers from the early 1800s, right around the time of Argentina's independence movement, that put the scale of this population beyond any doubt. In Buenos Aires, the capital and largest city, Afro-descendants, meaning both enslaved and free black people, along with those of mixed African and European ancestry, made up roughly 30% of the population according to the 1810 census, the same year Argentina began its formal break from Spanish colonial rule. In certain age cohorts, the numbers were even starker. Among residents between the ages of 10 and 29 in Buenos Aires, black residents actually outnumbered white residents in that same 1810 count. Read that again. In the city that would become the capital of one of the whitest presenting nations in the Western Hemisphere, in the exact generation that came of age during the independence movement. Black residents were the majority among young people. And Buenos Aires was not even the most heavily black region of the emerging country. Move inland, into the interior provinces, and the numbers climb even higher. Santiago del Estero and Catamarca, two provinces in the country's north-central interior, recorded black and mixed-race populations exceeding 50% of their total population in censuses from this period. Cordoba, one of the country's most important colonial cities and still one of its largest today, had a substantial Afro-descendant population tied closely to its role as a hub of colonial commerce, religious institutions, and agricultural production, much of which depended on enslaved labor. Salta and Tucumán, provinces in the northwest with strong ties to the colonial trade routes running up into Bolivia and Peru, carried significant black populations as well, connected to the mining economy of Upper Peru and the mule trains that supplied it. This was not a country with an incidental black population confined to a single port city. This was a country whose demographic foundation, from the capital to the deep interior, was substantially African and Afro-descendant. That foundation built the physical city itself. Enslaved and free Afro-Argentines worked the docks of Buenos Aires, loaded and unloaded the ships that carried the colony's silver, hides, and agricultural exports. They worked as domestic servants in the households of the colonial elite, as artisans, as bricklayers and carpenters who built the churches and government buildings that still stand in the historic center of Buenos Aires today. They worked the estancias, the vast cattle ranches of the Pampas, doing the grueling labor that generated the wealth the ranching aristocracy would later use to reinvent itself as a purely European elite. The physical infrastructure of colonial and early independent Argentina, the buildings, the docks, the roads, the churches, was built substantially by African and Afro-descendant hands. That labor is not a footnote. It is the foundation the rest of the country's wealth was built on top of. Beyond labor, Afro-Argentines built culture, and this is where the erasure becomes almost impossible to justify on any grounds beyond ideology, because you cannot deny a people's presence while simultaneously performing the art form they created. The neighborhoods of San Telmo and Montserrat in Buenos Aires, today marketed to tourists as the historic, picturesque heart of the old city, were in the 18th and 19th century centers of Afro-Argentine life. Montserrat in particular was home to a district so associated with African drumming and communal gathering that it carried the popular nickname Barrio del Tambor, the neighborhood of the drum. It was here in these barrios that enslaved and free Afro-Argentines gathered on Sundays and feast days, organized themselves into mutual aid societies called naciones, organized by African ethnic and regional origin, and practiced candombe, drumming, dancing, and processional tradition brought directly from Central African religious and communal practice. Candombe was not just entertainment. It was a mechanism of community survival, mutual aid, spiritual continuity, and cultural memory for a population living under the brutal conditions of slavery and, after abolition, under continued social and economic marginalization. Candombe is the direct ancestor of the tango, and this lineage is one that Argentine popular culture has spent more than a century trying to obscure, while simultaneously exporting the dance itself as the country's defining national symbol to the entire world. The word milonga, referring to both a musical genre and a specific style of dance that is one of the essential building blocks of tango. Developed within the black communities of the Rio de la Plata region in the mid to late 1800s. The rhythmic structures, the syncopation, the call and response elements that characterize early tango music carry direct fingerprints of candombe's African rhythmic tradition. Musicologists who have traced the genealogy of tango carefully, rather than accepting the sanitized origin story taught in Argentine schools, consistently identify the fusion of African rhythmic tradition with European instrumentation, particularly the accordion-like bandoneon imported from Germany, and with the musical traditions of the European immigrant populations who later settled in the same port neighborhoods where Afro-Argentines lived. Tango, in its earliest form, in the brothels and tenements of the working-class port districts of Buenos Aires and Montevideo in the final decades of the 19th century, was a genuinely mixed-race musical and cultural product, born from the overlapping presence of Afro-Argentine, Afro-Uruguayan, Criollo, and newly arrived European immigrant populations sharing the same crowded, poor neighborhoods. The dance that Argentina exports to the world as the purest expression of its European sophistication was born, in substantial part, in the same neighborhoods where candombe drums were played, by the same communities whose history the country would spend the next century trying to erase. Now we get to the mechanics of the disappearance itself, and the first mechanism. The one that gets the least attention in popular retellings, but that demographic historians consider absolutely central, is death and war. Afro-Argentine men fought and died for Argentine independence, and for the subsequent conflicts of the young nation at rates dramatically disproportionate to their share of the population. And they did so under conditions specifically designed to place them in the most lethal positions available. Begin with the wars of independence themselves, fought between 1810 and roughly 1818 against Spanish colonial forces. General José de San Martin, the most celebrated military figure in Argentine history, the man credited with liberating not just Argentina but Chile and playing a decisive role in Peru's independence as well, led an army in which historians estimate roughly half the soldiers were black or mixed-race men, many of them formerly enslaved individuals who had been granted freedom specifically in exchange for military service. This was official policy. Enslaved men were offered manumission if they enlisted, a policy that solved two problems for the colonial and early independence era elite simultaneously. It provided desperately needed manpower for a war of independence that the small free population of European descent could not fight alone. And it did so without requiring any actual structural change to the economic and social order that depended on enslaved labor, because the men who died in battle would never return to claim the fuller freedoms and social position their sacrifice might otherwise have earned them. The regiment of Pardos y Morenos, formally organized units composed specifically of black and mixed-race soldiers, distinguished themselves in battle after battle throughout the independence wars, including in the campaigns that crossed the Andes into Chile. These were not marginal auxiliary units. They were core fighting formations, and their casualty rates reflected their consistent deployment in the most dangerous positions. One figure from this era deserves to be named specifically because her story, more than almost any other, captures the full arc of Afro-Argentine sacrifice followed by Afro-Argentine erasure. Mara Remedios del Valle was born enslaved sometime in the mid-1700s and went on to serve in the Army of the North during the Wars of Independence. First as what was effectively a combat nurse and support figure, and then, after both her husband and her sons were killed in the fighting, as an active combatant herself. She was wounded multiple times. She was captured by royalist Spanish forces and subjected to public flogging on at least one occasion, and by some accounts repeatedly, for her refusal to abandon her allegiance to the independence cause. General Manuel Belgrano, one of the most important figures of the Argentine independence movement, personally recognized her extraordinary courage and gave her the rank of captain, an honor essentially unheard of for a black woman in that era, and the nickname that would follow her, Madre de la Patria, Mother of the Homeland. She survived the wars. She did not survive Argentine memory. She spent her final years destitute, begging in the streets of Buenos Aires, a decorated military hero of the nation's founding struggle, reduced to poverty and forgotten by the very government she had helped bring into existence. She died in 1847 and was buried without ceremony or recognition. For over a century and a half, Mara Remedios del Valle was almost entirely absent from Argentine historical memory, a footnote at best in a handful of specialist texts. It was not until the early 2000s, driven by the sustained work of Afro-Argentine activists and historians pushing to correct the historical record, that her story was recovered, publicized, and eventually formally honored. In 2013, the Argentine government designated November 8th, the date of her death, as the National Day of Afro-Argentines and Afro-Argentine culture. It took 166 years after her death for the nation to formally acknowledge the woman it had called the Mother of the Homeland while she lived. Alongside Mara Remedios del Valle stands the story of Falucho, a black Argentine soldier serving in the campaign in Peru in the 1820s, celebrated in Argentine national mythology for a single act, refusing an order to salute the Spanish flag after a mutiny and being executed on the spot for that refusal, becoming a martyr symbol of loyalty and patriotic sacrifice. Falucho received monuments. Streets and public spaces across Argentina bear his name. His story was folded into the national mythology in a way that Mara Remedios del Valle's was not, in part because a single dramatic death in defense of the flag fit neatly into a simple patriotic narrative in a way that a woman's decades of sustained sacrifice, wounding, capture, and subsequent abandonment by the state did not. Even in the selective ways Argentina chose to remember its Afro-descendant heroes, the pattern of what got remembered and what got erased reveals which parts of the story served the national myth and which parts complicated it. The pattern of disproportionate Afro-Argentine military death did not end with independence. It continued through every subsequent major conflict the young nation fought. The Argentine-Brazilian War, also called the Cisplatin War, fought between 1825 and 1828 over control of the Banda Oriental, the territory that would become Uruguay, again drew heavily on black and mixed-race soldiers for its infantry ranks. Uruguay's Guerra Grande, a civil conflict during the 1840s that drew in Argentine forces and factions, continued the same pattern of disproportionate Afro-descendant conscription and casualties. Then came the conflict that demographic historians consistently identify as the single most devastating blow to the Afro-Argentine male population, the War of the Triple Alliance, fought from 1864 to 1870, pitting Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay against Paraguay. This war remains, to this day, the bloodiest interstate conflict in the history of Latin America, with Paraguay alone losing a catastrophic share of its entire population, but Argentina's own losses, concentrated disproportionately among Afro-Argentine conscripts placed in frontline infantry positions with minimal training and equipment, were severe enough to permanently alter the demographic composition of the young men available to the Afro-Argentine community for marriage and family. Formation in the decades that followed. Academic research on 19th century Buenos Aires census data, including work published examining what scholars term the black undercount in Argentine historical demography, has specifically identified the death toll of Afro-descendant men across this sequence of conflicts, from the wars of independence through the Argentine-Brazilian War. The Guerra Grande, and finally the War of the Triple Alliance, as a central driver of the statistical disappearance that shows up so starkly in the census data of the following decades. This is where the second mechanism enters, and it flows directly from the first, the sex ratio collapse within the Afro-Argentine community. When you remove a hugely disproportionate share of a population's young men across 4 generations of continuous warfare, spanning from the 1810s through the 1870s, you do not just lose those individual men. You permanently distort the marriage market for the women left behind. Afro-Argentine women, finding the pool of available Afro-Argentine men catastrophically depleted. Increasingly formed families with white Argentine men, and with a growing population of European immigrants arriving in the country. This was not a matter of individual romantic choice operating in a demographic vacuum. It was the structural result of a policy of military conscription that had already removed the men those women might otherwise have partnered with. Each subsequent generation born from these unions carried progressively less visible African ancestry in terms of physical appearance, and each generation was correspondingly more likely to be classified by the census, by the church, by the state, and eventually by the individuals themselves, as white or as some category other than black. The disappearance of the Afro-Argentine population from the census was not, in large part, actual disappearance. It was reclassification, generation after generation, driven initially by a demographic crisis that the state itself had engineered through its conscription policies. The third mechanism was disease, and here the story moves from unintended consequence to something closer to negligent, if not deliberate, structural violence. Buenos Aires in the mid to late 19th century was hit by a sequence of devastating epidemics. Cholera outbreaks struck in 1867 and other years across the 1860s. Then, in 1871, the city was hit by a catastrophic yellow fever epidemic that remains one of the deadliest public health disasters in Argentine history, killing thousands of residents within a matter of months. The wealthy families of neighborhoods like San Telmo, which had until that point been a fashionable district for the colonial and early Republican elite, fled en masse to the northern parts of the city to escape the contagion, a mass exodus so complete and so consequential that it permanently transformed San Telmo's social character, turning the abandoned mansions of the fleeing elite into subdivided tenement housing conventillos for the working poor, including the Afro-Argentine and immigrant communities who could not afford to flee. The epidemic itself was a natural disaster, driven by inadequate sanitation infrastructure, poor water systems, and the mosquito populations that thrived in the city's environmental conditions. But the distribution of its lethality was not natural at all. It fell overwhelmingly on the crowded, poorly serviced neighborhoods where the Afro-Argentine population had been concentrated for generations by a combination of economic marginalization and, in earlier periods, formal or informal residential segregation. When the wealthy fled north and the poor stayed behind to die, the epidemic completed. Through disease. What wars had already begun through conscription, another sharp demographic reduction in the very population whose numbers were already collapsing from decades of frontline military sacrifice. Now we arrive at the mechanism that ties everything together, that was not an accident of war or an unintended consequence of urban sanitation failure, but a conscious, articulated, state-sponsored ideological project, Blanqueamiento, the whitening of the nation. This was not a vague cultural preference that emerged organically. It was explicit government policy, championed by name by some of the most celebrated figures in official Argentine history. Domingo Faustino Sarmiento, president of Argentina from 1868 to 1874, remains one of the most revered figures in Argentine national mythology, celebrated above all as the father of Argentine public education, credited with building the school system that dramatically increased national literacy, and that Argentines to this day cite with genuine pride as a foundational achievement of their republic. Sarmiento was also, by his own extensive writing, an open and explicit believer in the racial superiority of European populations and the racial inferiority of black, indigenous, and mixed-race populations. In his private diary, in an entry from 1848, years before he became president, he wrote with startling coldness about what he termed the problem of black populations. Using language that described black Argentines as an obstacle to be overcome rather than as citizens to be served. His broader body of writing, including his famous work Facundo, a foundational text of Argentine literature that is still assigned reading in Argentine schools today, is saturated with a civilizational framework that divides the world into what Sarmiento termed civilization. Associated explicitly with European culture and whiteness, and barbarism, associated with indigenous black and mixed-race populations and with the rural, non-European culture of the Argentine interior. This was not subtext. It was Sarmiento's explicit, stated intellectual framework, published, celebrated, and taught to generations of Argentine schoolchildren without any serious reckoning with what that framework meant for the actual black and indigenous citizens of the country he governed. As president, Sarmiento did not merely hold these views privately, he acted on them. His administration pursued policies that further marginalized Afro-Argentines economically and socially, while simultaneously throwing open Argentina's doors to mass European immigration on a scale that would permanently and irreversibly alter the demographic composition of the entire nation. The Argentine Constitution itself, in its original 1853 form, included language explicitly encouraging European immigration as a matter of national policy, reflecting a broader consensus among the country's governing elite, not limited to Sarmiento alone, that the nation's future prosperity and claim to civilization depended on becoming demographically European. That immigration project, once launched, proceeded at a scale that is difficult to overstate. Between approximately 1870 and 1930, Argentina received one of the largest waves of European immigration relative to its existing population of any nation in the world during that era. Millions of Italians, Spaniards, and to smaller but still significant degrees, Germans, French. And other Europeans arrived in Argentina during this 60-year window, drawn by government-sponsored recruitment campaigns, subsidized passage schemes, and the promise of land and economic opportunity in a country that was actively marketing itself to European populations as an extension of Europe transplanted to South American soil. The scale of this immigration was such that by the early 20th century, in Buenos Aires specifically, a majority of the city's residents were either first-generation immigrants or the immediate children of immigrants, a demographic transformation so total that it fundamentally rewrote the ethnic composition of the country's most important city within the span of 2 generations. This was not immigration policy in the neutral sense of a nation simply welcoming newcomers. It was demographic engineering, explicitly conceived and explicitly justified in the writings of Sarmiento and the broader governing class of the era, as a mechanism for overwhelming and diluting the existing black, indigenous, and mixed-race population out of visible national existence. You did not need violence to erase a people from the demographic record if you could simply flood the country with several million new arrivals and let intermarriage do the rest across 2 or 3 generations. The census data from this period tells the story in numbers so stark that they have become the central statistical evidence cited by every serious historian who has studied this disappearance. The 1810 census, as we have established, recorded Afro-descendants at roughly 30% of the population of Buenos Aires. By the time of the 1887 national census, that same population, recorded in the same city, had collapsed to approximately 1.8%. From 30% to under 2% within 77 years, spanning almost exactly the period of the Independence Wars, the subsequent 19th century conflicts, the epidemics, and the beginning of the mass European immigration project. This is not a gradual demographic drift. This is a demographic collapse of a magnitude that demands the kind of multi-causal explanation, war deaths, disease, intermarriage-driven reclassification, and deliberate immigration policy that we have just walked through in detail. The story does not stop in 1887. Argentine census practices themselves changed in ways that actively obscured whatever Afro-descendant population remained. Racial categories were dropped from national census questionnaires for extended periods across the 20th century, meaning that even Argentines who might have identified as Afro-descendant had no formal mechanism to register that identity in the national count. When a more careful accounting was attempted in 1947, the resulting national census identified only about 15,000 people nationwide as black or of African descent, broken down into a small core population identified specifically as black, and a somewhat larger population identified as mixed race or mulatto. By 1963, further counts placed the Afro-Argentine population at approximately 17,000 nationwide, and a country whose total population by that point numbered in the tens of millions. A population that had constituted roughly a third of the capital city, and over half of several interior provinces a century and a half earlier, had been reduced in the official statistical record of the nation. To a number so small it was treated as a rounding error, a historical curiosity rather than a living community with an ongoing claim on the national story. Alongside the demographic reduction ran the cultural and narrative erasure, and this is the dimension of the story that separates Argentina's history from almost any comparable case in the Western Hemisphere. It was not enough, apparently, for the ruling class to reduce the black population through war, disease, and engineered immigration. The national story itself had to be rewritten to make it appear as though that population had never mattered in the first place, or had simply chosen of its own accord to fade away. In 1905, a popular Argentine magazine published a piece that has become one of the most frequently cited artifacts in the historical literature on this erasure, a triumphant article celebrating what it described as the disappearance of the country's black population, using the striking and deeply telling metaphor that the African tree had, in the fullness of time, produced white flowers. This was not a fringe publication expressing a marginal view. It reflected the mainstream consensus of the Argentine intellectual and political class of the era, a consensus that treated the demographic vanishing of black Argentines not as a tragedy or even a neutral historical fact, but as a national achievement, evidence that the whitening project had succeeded. School curricula reinforced the same erasure across the following century. Generations of Argentine schoolchildren were taught a national history in which the country's founding heroes, its independence struggle, its cultural achievements including the Tango, were presented as fundamentally European and Criollo accomplishments, with the African and Afro-Argentine contribution either omitted entirely or reduced to a passing mention of slavery as a regrettable but minor historical footnote rather than a foundational demographic and economic reality. The tango's candombe roots were minimized or reattributed to European musical influence alone. The extensive Afro-Argentine contribution to the independence wars, exemplified by Mara Remedios del Valle and the regiments of Pardos y Morenos, was left out of standard textbook narratives almost entirely, surviving only in specialist historical literature that the vast majority of Argentines never encountered in their formal education. The cumulative effect of this century and a half of demographic reduction combined with narrative erasure was total. By the latter half of the 20th century, the overwhelming majority of Argentines, including many with substantial African ancestry themselves, genuinely believed that their country had never had a significant black population. That the small number of enslaved Africans brought to the colonial Rio de la Plata had simply died out or been absorbed so completely and so long ago as to be irrelevant to the country's modern identity. This belief was not a lie that people were consciously maintaining. It was, and to a significant extent remains, a genuinely held understanding of national history. Built and reinforced across 5 or 6 generations of formal education, popular culture, and official state messaging that had systematically removed the African and Afro-Argentine presence from the story the nation told about itself. But the people did not actually disappear, and this is where the modern scientific and historical reckoning becomes genuinely remarkable. Genetic research conducted in Argentina over the past 2 decades, examining the mitochondrial DNA and broader genetic ancestry of the modern Argentine population, has repeatedly found that a meaningful percentage of Argentines who identify, and have always identified, as fully white and of purely European descent in fact carry detectable African genetic ancestry. The biological signature of the very population that the national narrative insists never significantly existed. These are not distant symbolic traces. In some studies, the percentage of the modern Argentine population carrying African genetic markers has been found to be significant enough that demographic historians describe the popular self-image of Argentina as an essentially all-white, all-European nation as fundamentally incompatible with the genetic reality of its own population. The people did not vanish. They were absorbed, generation by generation, into a population that then told itself, and told the world, that it had never contained them in the first place. The academic reckoning with this history has been building steadily since roughly the turn of the 21st century, driven substantially by the work and advocacy of Afro-Argentine community organizations and activists who refuse to accept their own erasure from the national record. Organizations representing Afro-Argentine descendants, along with a growing body of academic historians both within Argentina and internationally, have spent the past 2.5 decades systematically reconstructing the buried history we have just walked through, recovering the story of Mara Remedios del Valle from obscurity, documenting the disproportionate military casualties among Afro-Argentine soldiers across the 19th century. Conflicts, tracing the Candom roots of tango through careful musicological and historical research, and pushing, successfully, for the Argentine state to formally reintroduce a question on African descent into the national census after decades of its absence. That reintroduction has produced numbers that themselves tell an important part of the modern story. Recent census efforts that have included an Afro-descendant identification question have found well over 300,000 people across Argentina willing to identify as being of African descent, a figure that dwarfs the 15 to 17,000 recorded in the mid 20th century counts, and that continues to grow with each subsequent. Count as public awareness of this reclaimed identity spreads, and as the social stigma that once made such identification something to avoid gradually erodes. This growth does not reflect a sudden new migration or a demographic event. It reflects people who were always there, whose ancestry was always present in their family histories. Finally finding a national context in which claiming that ancestry feels possible rather than something to conceal or deny. The Argentine state itself has, in recent years, begun to formally acknowledge this history in ways that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. The designation of November 8th as the National Day of Afro-Argentines and Afro-Argentine culture, marking the anniversary of Mar Remedios del Valle's death, represents an official government acknowledgement of a historical narrative the state itself spent a century and a half working to suppress. Universities across Argentina have developed dedicated research programs examining Afro-Argentine history, the demographic mechanics of the population's statistical disappearance, and the cultural contributions, particularly around candombe and tango, that had been systematically minimized in the national story. Museums and cultural institutions in Buenos Aires have begun mounting exhibitions specifically addressing this history, a marked shift from a cultural establishment that for generations treated the Afro-Argentine story as either non-existent or peripheral to the nation's core identity. Now bring all of this back to the football pitch, because that is where this entire buried history becomes visible to millions of people who have never read a single page of Argentine demographic history, but who have watched hundreds of hours of Argentine football and quietly wondered, without ever quite articulating it, why the team looks the way it does. When you watch Argentina field a squad that is overwhelmingly composed of players with European surnames and European features, drawing heavily from the descendants of the Italian and Spanish immigrants who arrived in the Great Waves between 1870 and 1930, you are looking at the direct, visible, living outcome of the exact historical process we have just spent this entire hour walking through. This is not a coincidence of talent development or footballing culture operating in a demographic vacuum. It is the sporting expression of a deliberate national project, a population reduced through disproportionate war deaths across 4 generations of conflict, further reduced through epidemic disease concentrated by residential segregation. Diluted through a demographic sex ratio collapse that pushed Afro-Argentine women into unions with Whiten immigrant men, and then overwhelmed entirely by a state-sponsored immigration project explicitly designed, in the words of the president who championed it, to solve what he termed the problem of the country's black population. Compare this directly to Brazil, sharing a border, sharing a colonial Portuguese and Spanish imperial history of enslavement, sharing the same football-obsessed culture, and you see the counterfactual playing out in real time on a different pitch. Brazil received a vastly larger number of enslaved Africans than Argentina during the colonial period. Was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery, doing so only in 1888, and never pursued anything approaching Argentina's scale and intensity of demographic and narrative erasure. Brazil's black and mixed-race population remained large, visible, and central to the country's cultural and athletic identity in the 20th century. Producing generation after generation of black footballing legends from Belle to Ronaldinho to Vinicius Jr., whose presence on the national team was never treated as anomalous because Brazil never ran the century-and-a-half campaign of statistical and narrative disappearance that Argentina did. The two countries inherited similar colonial starting points. They arrived at dramatically different demographic and cultural endpoints because one nation chose, deliberately and with explicit state backing, to erase what the other nation, whatever its own serious and ongoing struggles with racism and inequality, never tried to erase to the same totalizing degree. So here is the full picture, laid out in the detail it actually deserves rather than compressed into a soundbite. Afro-Argentines built the docks, the churches, and the government buildings of colonial and early Republican Buenos Aires. They made up roughly a third of the capital and more than half of several interior provinces at the moment of national independence. They fought and died for that independence at rates far exceeding their share of the population, embodied by heroes like Mar Remedios del Valle, who gave everything to the nation and received poverty and forgetting in return. They continued to die disproportionately in every major conflict the young republic fought for the next 60 years, culminating in the catastrophic War of the Triple Alliance. They were decimated further by epidemics whose lethality was concentrated by the same segregation and neglect that had shaped where they were allowed to live. They watched their community's gender balance collapse under the weight of war deaths, pushing subsequent generations into unions that diluted the visible African ancestry of their descendants, with each passing decade. They were then demographically overwhelmed by a state-sponsored immigration project explicitly designed by a celebrated national president to whiten the country and erase what he saw as the problem their existence represented. And finally, having been reduced through war, disease, intermarriage, and immigration, their remaining history and cultural contribution, including the very tango the nation would export to the entire world as its defining symbol, was written out of the textbooks, the museums, and the popular imagination so completely that most Argentines alive today have no idea any of this happened. They did not disappear. They were erased in stages over 150 years by policy, by war, by disease exploited through neglect, and finally by a national mythology constructed specifically to make people forget that the erasure had ever needed to happen at all. The tree was never actually producing white flowers on its own. Someone cut off every other branch first, and then told the world the tree had simply always grown that way. The resurgence happening now, the recovered stories, the genetic studies, the growing census numbers, the university research programs, the formal National Day of Recognition is not just historical curiosity catching up with the truth. It is a living community whose ancestors were told their sacrifice would be remembered, and then were systematically forgotten, finally being handed back the history that was always theirs. So the next time you watch Argentina lift a trophy, run through the demographics of the squad, and quietly wonder where the black players are, you will know the answer is not a mystery of geography or genetics or coincidence. It is the visible monument to what a nation decided, over a century and a half, to make disappear. They were half of some cities. They built a dance the whole world now claims is purely European. They died on the front lines of every war the young republic fought, and the country repaid every one of those sacrifices by writing them out of its own memory. Now you know why the team looks the way it does. And now, in far more detail than the highlight reel version could ever give you, you know they were there all along. And you know exactly how they were made to disappear. What happened to the Afro-Argentine footballers who did exist, the ones who were good enough to play, before the Whitening Project finished its work? That question rarely gets asked because the assumption baked into the whole conversation is that there simply were none. That Argentine football sprang fully formed from Italian and Spanish immigrant communities with no black presence in its early history to erase in the first place. That assumption is wrong, and the record of its wrongness sits in the early history of Argentine football itself, in a period before the sport had fully consolidated into the whites' only image it would later project to the world. Argentine football, in its founding decades, from the 1880s through the early 1900s, developed initially among British expatriate communities in Buenos Aires, before spreading into the broader population. And in that broader population, in a city that even by the later 19th century still carried a meaningful Afro-Argentine presence concentrated in neighborhoods like San Telmo and Montserrat. Black and mixed race players were part of the sport's early amateur clubs. Historical research into the founding rosters of some of Argentina's oldest football clubs has identified Afro-Argentine names among early club members and players, individuals whose presence in the sport's founding decades has been almost entirely omitted from the institutional histories those same clubs now publish about their own origins. The clubs that today present themselves in their century-plus histories as naturally, inevitably European in composition were not always so. Their early membership roles reflected the demographic reality of the city they were founded in, a city that, even as it was undergoing the fastest phase of its whitening transformation, still contained black and Afro-descendant Argentines who joined in this new sport, just as they had in every other dimension of the city's social and cultural life. What happened to the Afro-Uruguayan connection, and why does Uruguay's much smaller and much more visibly preserved black football history matter for understanding what Argentina lost? Uruguay, sharing the same Rio de la Plata estuary, the same colonial slave port history through Montevideo, and the same candombe cultural tradition that fed into Tango on both sides of the river, did not erase its Afro-descendant population with anything like Argentina's thoroughness. Uruguay's black community, though numerically much smaller than Argentina's had once been, remained visible, remained connected to its own cultural traditions including candombe, which is still celebrated as a living, government-recognized cultural heritage in Uruguay today with UNESCO recognition, and remained present in Uruguayan football, producing celebrated black and Afro-descendant players across the 20th century and a footballing culture that never had to fully suppress or forget where a meaningful share of its population came from. The contrast between the two banks of the same river, one erasing almost totally and one preserving imperfectly but genuinely, is itself one of the most useful natural experiments in this entire history, because it demonstrates that the outcome Argentina arrived at was never inevitable. It was a choice, made and enforced over generations, that a nearly identical neighboring society, facing nearly identical historical starting conditions, simply did not make to the same degree. Why did the myth of a naturally, essentially European Argentina become so central to the country's self-image on the world stage, beyond simple racial ideology, and what economic interests reinforced it? The answer runs directly through Argentina's economic relationship with Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a period historians often call Argentina's Belle Époque. When the country became one of the wealthiest nations on Earth per capita, its economy built on beef and grain exports to Britain and continental Europe. Argentina's ruling agricultural and commercial elite had enormous financial incentive to market their nation to European investors, immigrants, and trading partners as culturally and racially continuous with Europe itself. An extension of European civilization onto South American soil rather than a mixed race, post-colonial society with deep African roots. This was not merely an internal ideological project. It was an international branding exercise, and it worked spectacularly well. European capital flowed into Argentine railways, ports, and agricultural infrastructure, partly because European investors perceived Argentina as fundamentally continuous with their own civilization, rather than as another Latin American nation shaped by the same colonial slave economy that had produced Brazil, Cuba, or Haiti. The Whitening project was not only about internal social control. It was a deliberate act of international economic positioning, and the erasure of the Afro-Argentine population was, from the perspective of the ruling elite conducting it, inseparable from the broader project of maximizing the nation's attractiveness to European capital and European settlers. What role did the Catholic Church play in either preserving or erasing Afro-Argentine religious and cultural practice? And how does that compare to Brazil's very different religious trajectory? In Brazil, African religious traditions survived and evolved into major syncretic faiths, Candomblé and Umbanda, which remain widely practiced today and are now recognized as significant components of Brazilian national cultural identity, taught in universities and celebrated in public festivals. In Argentina, the equivalent African-derived religious practices tied to the Naciones, the mutual aid and cultural societies organized by African ethnic origin that had structured community life in colonial Buenos Aires, were actively suppressed and discouraged by both church and state authorities across the 19th century as the Whitening Project intensified, treated as backward practices incompatible with the modern. European-facing national identity the elite was constructing. Candomblé itself, unlike its Afro-Brazilian religious counterparts, was gradually stripped of most of its explicitly religious and spiritual dimensions, and survived primarily in a more secularized, folkloric form, preserved by a shrinking community with diminishing institutional support. A preservation that succeeded only through the sheer determination of the Afro-Argentine families who kept passing the drumming traditions down within their own households and neighborhood associations, even as the wider society told them their traditions did not matter. What happened specifically in the interior provinces, in places like Santiago del Estero and Catamarca, where the Afro-descendant population once exceeded half the total, and why did those regions get erased even more completely than Buenos Aires? The interior provinces suffered a version of the erasure process specific to their own economic and demographic circumstances. Unlike Buenos Aires, which received the overwhelming bulk of the European immigration wave and therefore experienced its demographic transformation primarily through dilution, the interior provinces received comparatively few European immigrants, who overwhelmingly preferred to settle in the capital and the surrounding Pampas region where the export agriculture economy offered the greatest opportunity. In the interior, the mechanism of erasure operated more through internal migration, economic marginalization, and a particularly aggressive and thorough application of racial reclassification and local record-keeping, where provincial elites, eager to present their own regions as aligned with the increasingly dominant national narrative of European Argentina, systematically reclassified mixed-race and Afro-descendant populations in local census and church records as white, mestizo, or simply criollo, erasing the specific African component of their ancestry from the written record even more completely than occurred in the capital. This is part of why some of the demographic reconstruction work being done today by historians studying the interior provinces has had to rely heavily on genetic testing and painstaking archival reconstruction of individual family lines, since the official written record for large stretches of the 19th and 20th centuries in these provinces is far less reliable as a guide to actual ancestry than the record for Buenos Aires, precisely because the reclassification there was pursued with even greater local zeal. What does the modern Afro-Argentine community actually look like today? Where do they live? And what specific organizations are doing the work of reclamation on the ground right now? The modern Afro-Argentine population, alongside the descendants of the historical population now rediscovering and reclaiming that ancestry, also includes a newer and demographically significant wave. Immigrants from Cape Verde who arrived in Argentina in the early 20th century and established a distinct, continuously visible Afro-Argentine community, along with more recent immigrants from Senegal and other West and Central. African nations who have arrived in the past few decades. Organizations including the Casa de la Cultura Indo-Afroamericana in Buenos Aires and the broader network of Afro-Argentine cultural and advocacy associations have spent the past 2 decades doing the granular work of oral history collection, documenting elderly community members' family memories before that generation is gone. Organizing public candombe performances and workshops specifically designed to teach the tradition to younger Afro-Argentines who grew up disconnected from it, and lobbying government agencies at the municipal and national level for the formal recognition, census inclusion, and cultural funding that the community was denied for a century and a half. This is not abstract historical work happening only in university archives. It is a living political and cultural movement, run by descendants who are actively rebuilding a connection to an identity their own grandparents were often pressured, explicitly or through decades of social stigma, to downplay or deny entirely. Why does this history matter beyond Argentina and beyond football, and what does it reveal about how national myths get built everywhere, not just in South America? The Argentine case is significant specifically because of how complete and how successful the erasure was, which makes it one of the clearest available case studies anywhere in the world for understanding the actual mechanics by which a nation can take a demographic reality. In this case, a Black and Afro-descendant population that was not marginal, but foundational, and rewrite it into non-existence within the span of a few generations, using tools that were not limited to violence alone, but included war conscription policy, immigration policy, epidemic exacerbating neglect, and finally sustained control over education and public memory. Every nation with a history of slavery and colonial conquest has some version of this mechanism operating somewhere in its own past. Some story it tells about who its people naturally, essentially are, that turns out, on close examination of the actual demographic and documentary record, to be a constructed narrative rather than an inevitable fact. Argentina's case is unusually well documented and unusually stark, because the starting numbers, 30 to 50% Black and Afro-descendant populations in major cities and provinces at the moment of independence, were so large, and the ending numbers, under 2% within 70 years, so small, that the scale of the transformation cannot be explained away as gradual natural. Assimilation. It requires the specific historical mechanisms we have traced, and it stands as a warning about how easily and how thoroughly a national story can be rewritten when a government has both the will and the sustained multi-generational capacity to do it. So here is where the fuller picture leaves us. The team you watch today. The Argentina that lifted the World Cup with Messi at the front of it is not just the product of talented players and a rich footballing culture built by Italian and Spanish immigrant communities. It is also, in its very composition, the end product of a demographic engineering project that started with Mara Remedios del Valle bleeding for a nation that would later let her beg in the streets. Ran through decades of Afro-Argentine soldiers placed deliberately at the front of every war the young republic fought. Continued through epidemics that killed disproportionately in neighborhoods the state had already neglected. Was accelerated by a president still celebrated today as the father of Argentine education, who wrote privately and coldly about Black people as a problem to be solved. Was completed by a flood of millions of European immigrants brought in explicitly to dilute what remained, and was then locked into permanent public memory by a century of textbooks, magazines, and official silence that told every subsequent generation of Argentines that none of this had ever really happened. The genetic evidence says otherwise. The 300,000 and growing number of Argentines now willing to claim Afro-descendant identities say otherwise. The candombe drums still being taught to a new generation in Buenos Aires say otherwise. And the next time the Argentine national anthem plays before a match, and the camera pans across a squad that looks almost entirely European, you will know you are looking at the finished product of a project that took 150 years, an enormous amount of deliberate policy, and the near-total cooperation of the nation's own historical memory to complete. They built the docks. They built the drums that became the dance the whole world thinks of as pure European elegance. They died in every war so a republic could exist. And then that republic spent a century and a half making sure the world, and eventually its own citizens, would forget they had ever been there at all.